I want to thank everybody for being here. I know that we're incredibly busy and on screens all day, but we were really excited to host this event. So welcome to today's event. I am Dolores Casillas. I'm the director of the Chicano Studies Institute. I'm also faculty in Chicana and Chicano Studies here at UCSB and your host today. This is a co-sponsored event between CSI, the Chicano Studies Institute, as well as the Center for Information Technology and Society, a center that I'm also affiliated with. It is directed by Distinguished Professor of Communication and our Presidential Chair in Technology and Society, Joe Walther, who in December, when I approached this idea, enthusiastically said, let's do it. So I really appreciate his cooperation and co-sponsorship. So we felt it was important not to recap 2020 because there isn't enough time or wine to do that, but a week after inauguration, a week after seeing the bust of Cesar Chavez grace the Oval Office, a week after never having to say again that no woman has ever been vice president, and a week of science taking its rightful place within matters of public health. So yes, let's pause, let's take stock of our very unique electoral season within the global pandemic and the broad role of media and ongoing mistrust and challenges of trust between institutions, government, media, public health, and Chicanx and Latinax communities. So we will have two panelists today. Sonia Diaz is the founding executive director of the UCLA Latino Policy and Politics Initiative. This is a comprehensive think tank that addresses the most critical domestic policy challenges facing communities of color in states and localities across the US. An attorney, a voter rights activist, and co-author of The Power of the New Majority, a 10-state analysis of voters of color in the 2020 election, Diaz served as policy counsel to US Senator Kamala Harris during her first terms as California Attorney General. And Cristina Beltran, Associate Professor of Social and Cultural Analysis at New York University, who works at the intersections of Latino politics and political theory. Her award-winning books include The Trouble with Unity, Latino Politics and the Creation of Identity, and her most recent book, Cruelty as Citizenship, How Migrant Suffering Sustains White Democracy. She is a former resident member at both the Institute for the Advanced Study at Princeton, as well as the School for Advanced Research in Santa Fe, New Mexico, and she is also the occasional guest for MSNBC. So I want to begin, before Sonia begins with her remarks, I want to begin with two short videos to set the scene for today's discussion. So the first one is, and this should be maybe recognizable to those who view Spanish language television in the Santa Barbara area, the most aired Trump campaign commercial in the Santa Barbara area, as well as the most aired commercial we saw with Biden. Notably, Trump's commercial is in Spanish, and Biden's commercial is actually in Spanglish with subtitles. And I think these two commercials kind of side by side tells us a lot about how Latino voters are imagined or what kind of images and ideas still exist about Chicana and Latina OX communities.
But one objective. Color I see that you maintain the status.
December 7th, 9th.
I'm gonna question a psychopath.
The Orby has nothing to fear.
Ay, por Dios, yo voy a votar por Donald Trump. La buena vida, por Trump. La economía, por Trump. Hazlo por tu familia, latinos por Donald Trump. Ay, por Dios, yo voy a votar por Donald Trump.
I'm Donald Trump, and I approve this message.
Dime con quién andas y te diré quién eres. That's what our abuelos and abuelas taught us. Now, Joe confirmed he's walking with perfect company. Una aliada and a champion of the Latino community for years. Kamala is the final piece of the puzzle. Together, Biden and Harris will rebuild the American dream and ensure a future para todos.
And everyone can imagine my horror at listening to my 8-year-old sing that little Trump jingle, because it is catchy, randomly one day last fall. So heavily circulated on Spanish language televisions here. The second video is to remind everyone of how Latino voters and Latino communities occupied headlines. In this next video, it's 4 minutes in length, and we took a snapshot of different headlines and news pieces that we've seen through the electoral season. And often it was media covering media, and often a bit late, in my opinion. And it did focus on misinformation, which I often say disinformation, because it seems to be a purposeful agenda to disseminate information like that. And we did hear accounts of it happening on WhatsApp and robocalls. So we'll see that.
But one objective. What color I see that you maintain the status.
December 7th, 19.
And a question a psychopath.
The Orby has nothing to fear.
Sorry, if you did not want to see that one again, it's this one.
But one objective. What color I see that you maintain the status.
December 7th, 19.
And a question a psychopath.
The Orby has nothing to fear.
Real change never takes place from the top on down, but always from the bottom on up.
La idea de atención médica para todos de Bernie Sanders está ganando apoyo. Colegiatura universitaria gratuita.
Trump dice que Joe Biden devastaría la economía, pero fue Biden quien nos sacó de la recesión del 2008.
Sacrificamos mucho para ser libres y respetados. Ahora la izquierda le ha montado un acto de repudio a Goya, la marca que nos encanta, tan solo porque Goya está trabajando con el presidente. Los demócratas y Joe Biden son demasiado extremistas. Socialismo. Cortarle los fondos a la policía. From the wrong election date on Twitter to fake robocalls.
If you vote by mail, your personal information will be part of a public database.
Experts are now sounding the alarm about digital disinformation aimed squarely at Black and Latino voters. Since January, almost a quarter of the 13 million mentions of vote by mail on social media included misinformation. Misinformation.
It's too soon to know the exact number of Latinos who voted for Biden or Trump in this election, but exit polls from CNN and ABC estimate that Biden Biden gained a higher percentage of the Latino vote in Arizona.
We knew that not until the day that we have real political power, we would be able to see the changes in policies and electing elected officials that align with our values. And those are what we're seeing today.
And with that, we will begin with Sonia Diaz. And I will close everything up for you.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much, Dr. Casillas, and so great to be here with Dr. Walter and Dr. Beltran. I'm going to share some data with you that would be really helpful for contextualizing today's conversation about Latino voters, not necessarily the Latino vote. And so we are really fortunate that the 4-year spotlight on Latinos is lasting a little longer because of both the impact and the misinformation and mischaracterization, frankly, of the Latino electorate in all of its diversity. So I run a think tank at UCLA called the Latino Policy and Politics Initiative. We really believe that every single issue is a Latino issue. And part of this is thinking about the ways in which Latinos interact with our democracy, both through elections, but also political representation and substantive representation. One of the things that became evident about the election was the outsized role of non-white voters. This was clear in the final outcome of sending Biden and Harris to the White House, but also important as we think about both voter suppression and misinformation, for which disinformation is a subcategory. Our research at UCLA estimated that almost a third, 30% of the electorate in 2020 was not white. And we saw where that made a difference in terms of this coalition of voters that ultimately sent Biden to the White House. And the coalition consisted of African-American voters, a minority of white voters, Latino voters, Asian American, and Indigenous voters. One of the things that is really important is the states where you had this multiracial, multi-ethnic coalition. And states that have large Asian Pacific Islander electorates, but also African-American and Latino electorates are many places on the coastal areas, but also through the US South and emerging electorates. Florida and Texas are most emblematic of this. If you ever go to a place like Houston, Texas, or even Gwinnett County, Georgia, there is a sense of being in Southern California, either in Los Angeles or Orange County, in terms of the multiracial, multi-ethnic electorate there. This is really important because outside of Black voters and white voters, Asian American and Latino voters are very young, which means they do not have the same access to information because they either are new voters or are not high propensity voters like their white peers. And this makes them very susceptible to not only being left out of the political mechanics of campaigning, but also this phenomenon that we see in the last 2 cycles of misinformation and voter suppression. So one of the things I like to drive home is that on election night, things were looking like Biden was doing well in Ohio, and in Florida it was neck and neck, and then Florida went for Trump. Ohio, despite all of the work of John Kasich, went for Trump. But Florida really changed the narrative on election night to zero in on Latino voters and this focus of Miami-Dade. One of the things that I think is really incongruent is this idea that Latinos have to be a monolith or singular in their dimensionality, meaning that we only care about immigration or we all vote the same. And I think that 2020 made that clear that that is not only erroneous, it is not forward thinking if we're going to recover from COVID-19 and also safeguard our democracy. So for me, akin to thinking that, all Latino voters vote the same, I also like to think about what's the policy substance here. And this ties into the misinformation, because a big issue for all of these voters is healthcare and COVID. And we're seeing the same type of misinformation and disinformation amongst Latinos in particular relating to the vaccine. So for Latino voters going into the election, they cared about jobs, they cared about healthcare, they cared about COVID. These are bread and butter issues. One of the things that is different is both COVID, because of the horrible response and underwhelming policy mandates from the White House under Donald Trump, but also the widespread racial animus. And so for that reason, for Latino voters, for the first time in public opinion polling, because of Donald Trump, started to really escalate the issue of racial and ethnic inequality, and also seen as discrimination against Latinos and against immigrants. So one of the things that's really important here is how did Latinos vote in 2020? And I can provide this deck to the audience later. We don't have to go through all of it, but you can't talk about the vote without talking about voter suppression. And part of this is the role of the Supreme Court in striking down Section 5 of the Voting Rights Act in their Shelby County decision from 2013. What this meant is that the states that you're looking at right now were no longer required to go and seek pre-clearance for a change, both in terms of their registration rules, early vote, you name it. These states had such a history of constitutional violation, and so it's the darker red states and then the brighter red had counties, so jurisdictions within those states, that violated the rights of minority voters. Now, after the Shelby County decision, we saw widespread voter ID laws, arduous voter registration, you name it. But one of the things that's really important about the 2020 election is the impact of the coronavirus pandemic on the ways in which people could cast a ballot. And this necessitated changes, including the expansion of vote by mail, for which many states that are dark red were not in favor of. So UCLA's Latino Policy and Politics Initiative Voting Rights Project sued the state of Texas to expand vote by mail. Now, vote by mail was also really important this election around misinformation and disinformation. In English flyers in Arizona, it was widely reported that there was an allegation that if people voted by mail, the government would be collecting more data on the voter. And that was purposeful in terms of targeting and dissuading Latino voters from casting a ballot. As we know, and I'm about to show you, Arizona made an incredible difference, not just for the presidency, but for the US Senate. So some fun facts. We just had a report that came out about a week ago from LPPI, and we estimate that 16.6 million Latino voters cast a ballot this past November. Now that's a 30.9% increase over the course of the last 2 election cycles. This is the highest 4-year increase in the history of the Latino vote. But also what's important is that if you compare 2016 to 2020, Latinos voters cast ballots almost double the number as non-Latino voters. Okay, so this is a place where we have a lot of reporting about Latinos, and part of this is that, there is a lack of acceptance that non-white people are multidimensional. And with that, this argument that Latinos are singular in both their political preferences, but also their policy preferences is not only erroneous, it's not supported by facts, it's really harmful for thinking about how we're going to have an inclusive democracy moving forward. So our research found that in the states that we surveyed, in a number of those states, Arizona, California, Colorado, Illinois, New Mexico, Nevada, Pennsylvania, Wisconsin, New York, Latino registered voters preferred Biden over Trump at 3-1. Now, Latino voters in Georgia, Texas, and Washington supported Biden 2-1. The only place where Latino voters preferred Donald Trump over Joe Biden was in Miami-Dade County, and that was by a 2-1 margin. I'll note that the rest of the state of Florida, overwhelmingly Latinos in the state of Florida supported Biden over Trump. Again, when we think about the news cycle, both election night and the days that it took to calculate the ballot and then ultimately certify the election, there was this focus and this blaming of Latino voters for Trump's ability to garner so many millions of votes, but in particular to win the state of Florida. And that was wrong, and that was short-sighted and part of the lack of representation and diversity in our newsrooms and their inability allow academics to study this and are from the community to be spokespeople. So here's a really interesting piece, and then I'll probably just kick it off so we can have this really dynamic conversation about misinformation and voter suppression. But Arizona is incredibly important, and it was really on the back of community organizing, akin to the work of Georgia and the Black communities in Georgia, of mobilizing a new majority of voters, non-white voters, and ensuring that we're expanding the electorate instead of persuading white voters to not vote the way that they told you they were going to vote. And so in Arizona, because of this trusted messaging, amidst a state that ultimately was under the purview of Section 5 of the Voting Rights Act, also has really arduous voter registration requirements, we saw that 75% of voters that lived in high Latino precincts, so precincts with a lot of Latino voters, 75% supported Biden. Now, this is really important because we saw in 2018 that Arizona, for the first time in decades then, sent Kristen Sinema to the United States Senate, a Democrat. And then following up in 2020, Arizona, for the first time since the 1990s, supported a Democratic candidate for the White House in supporting Joe Biden. They also were able to send Mark Kelly, another Democrat, to the US Senate. This was on the backs of Latino voters who, in comparison to their white peers, did not have the same high over Trump. I have a lot of data here that we can share, both in terms of battleground states, but also states with large Latino populations that are not competitive, including New York and California. But I'll end with Florida right here. And I think this is really important because in addition to recognizing that there was a sustained effort by the Republican Party to mobilize Latino voters over time, including ceding power to Latino electeds in upper echelon positions, like Marco Rubio for the US Senate, something that the state of California had yet to do in 170 years, that we still saw that in Miami-Dade counties in Florida for Latinos, there was a preference by Cuban Americans in particular and some Venezuelan Americans for Donald Trump. But we also know that the preference was different if you look at white versus Latino. So if you're looking at non-white Hispanic, their favorability for Donald Trump was higher than Latinos. And I think that's important and that gets missed. What I'll end with is just that I see the Latino electorate and Latino voters. What we know from 2020 is that they overwhelmingly supported Joe Biden across the US. But what was really important about this election is that there was a historical growth in turnout. We saw the highest numbers of Americans voting during a global pandemic when it was not easy to vote and people are dying. That was especially true for Latinos who tend to be younger, one of the age demographics that under indexes in terms of voting. But what was important is that they really swung elections, both the White House and then smaller down ballot races. And this was true in Wisconsin and in Georgia, where Latinos are less than 5% of the registered voters in those states. but they were able to coalesce with voters of color to tip the results in favor of Biden, who won by less than 1 percentage point. I think that it's really important that we keep monitoring and studying the nuances of the Latino vote so that we're better informed and better able to think about how voters are participating in democracy, what their barriers to democratic participation are, but most important, what are their policy preferences and what does their vote choice tell us about that? Thanks so much.
Thank you, Sonia. That was fascinating. And I have such a different view now of Miami-Dade County, knowing that fact as well. We are now going to switch to Cristina. We're going to hear her remarks, and then we will open it up for Q&A, and just a reminder to use the function at the bottom. Thank you so much.
Well, thanks so much. Thanks, Inez. And I'm thrilled to be here with Sonia and with UC Santa Barbara and Chicano Studies and the Institute and everybody here. I'm going to end up, I think, in some ways underscoring a lot of what Sonia already said. I'm a political theorist by training, and I think so a lot of my research has been on Latinx politics and the politics of democracy more broadly. So, which is also my excuse for why I don't have a PowerPoint. I'm just going to talk to you. It won't be nearly as appealing as the PowerPoints, but I think it'll allow us to also underscore certain points, and I'll try to keep my comments short so we can have a larger conversation about this. And I think one of the points I want to sort of underscore that Sonia was saying as well is, I think one thing that's so critical that the 2020 election highlighted is that we need to talk more about the qualities of simultaneity and Latino political diversity. So I want us to think about this question of sort of how do we talk about the multiplicity of populations and the simultaneity of different kinds of political formations, political assemblages that are happening within Latinx politics right now. And in part of that, I want to sort of conclude by talking a little bit about this idea that I recently published on, which was thinking about the idea of multiracial whiteness. So I'll sort of finish with that. But I think, a point Sonia made as well is that there is no, and we know this, I mean, this is an issue that in Latino and Latinx politics, Latinx studies, we have been saying, scholars have been making this point over and over again, which is that there is no single Latino community. Right? There's no, and politically, there is no single Latino political community. And so once again, 2020 revealed that we are a diverse population, not just demographically, but also ideologically. And this means that when it comes to politics, we can't, even though we can speak of the fact that Latinos are a disproportionately Democratic electorate, right? They are disproportionately aligned with the Democratic Party, but 2020 also reminds us there's no single story here. And I think I just want to sort of point out again, because I think this idea that after elections, and this happened in 2016 as well, when they talked about the sort of the blue wall that fell, right? And then sort of the tendency to blame Latino voters on what happens in elections. And I think there's been this sort of interesting tendency, and I'd like us to think about that, because often the population numbers are not large enough to warrant this sort of assault that happens, or this blame game that occurs. But I do think it speaks to a sort of tendency to want to look at, the Black voter who voted for Trump or the Latino voter who voted for Trump in a way as an effort to not look at whiteness, to not look at how many white people voted for Trump, to not acknowledge the fact that Donald Trump would not have gotten so many votes, he would not have won in 2016, and he would not have come as close to winning in 2020 without the white vote. And I think there's a kind of tendency for white voters to not necessarily want to look at that. And so there's a tendency, I think, to try to look at other populations. So I think it's really important to remember that it is the majority of white voters in the United States continued to support Donald Trump in 2016 and in 2020. And I think that fact is something we as Americans have to kind of reckon with. The reason Trump lost is because a significant minority of white voters, and that minority of white voters grew in 2020, but that a significant minority of white voters came together with a majority of African American, Latinx, Asian American, and Native voters. And that is the multiracial coalition that saved our democracy to fight another day. And that is the sort of multiracial democracy that gives me hope. But this fact, right? So I think it's really important to just always remember that fact as the conversation moves towards looking at what happened in Florida or Texas. But I also think with this issue of simultaneity, this fact that a majority of white voters supported Trump does not obviate the need to theorize that multiple Latino political communities always exist, always have existed, and are always possible. And that these Latinx electorates sometimes overlap and sometimes diverge from one another. And we saw this in the way that progressive, Sonia mentioned this, right? The way progressive grassroots organizing brought out Latinx voters in numbers that turned Nevada and Arizona blue, right? And the Latinx vote was also an important segment of the runoff in Georgia recently that helped give the Senate to Democrats. But we also saw Latino Trump supporters in states like Florida and Texas, and Latino voters in those states did help keep those states red, right? They are part of that story. So it's a story of, as Sonia mentioned, it's a story of voter suppression, which is a critical element of this. At the same time, I think it's really important that we not shy away from or not look away from the fact that after 4 years of Trump's authoritarian rule of sort of, you know, racially charged, racist politics, that Trump's share of the Latino vote this past November looks as if it rose slightly. Or at least it held steady, right? We're sort of, the exit polling numbers are always weird, and so Sonia's numbers are helping us make deeper sense of this. But notwithstanding years of incendiary rhetoric targeting Mexicans and other Latinx communities, we do have to make sense of the fact that a large number of Latinx people were still attracted to the politics of Trump. And I think this is going to require scholars and pundits and journalists to really think about this question. What are the distinctions between populations in rural areas? I think there's a really unexplored issue of what it means that so many Latinos are working in carceral and militarized settings, right? The fact that so many Latinos work for the Border Patrol, that so many work as police or have served in the military, that those sorts of employment in sort of carceral spaces as part of both the population within, but also the people who work for the Homeland Security state. What does that do to our politics? What impact has that had? What is the politics of masculinity and Latinx masculinity, and how is that shaping ideological formations and assemblages? So I think these are questions we have to keep asking ourselves about these communities. I think one thing we've all realized, it's clear that connecting politically and mobilizing and organizing within Latinx communities requires a variety of strategies that are attentive to issues of age, gender, class, race, ideology, region, sexuality, education, occupation, national origin, and generation, right? And clearly, it's the model of the organizations, Mi Gente, Voto Latino, all these different organizations across the country that have been doing that kind of years in and years out organizing that has so much to teach us, and that is a model for the future going forward. That we maybe have to think hard about relying on the Democratic Party, like that role, but the fact that I think we have to follow and build on the examples that we've seen in Georgia, Arizona, et cetera. But as I said before, I think it's also important that even though Latino Trump supporters are a minority of Latino voters, I think we have to not disregard or play down Latino conservatism and Latino right-wing politics or anti-Black Latinx politics. I think sometimes we have to sort of sit there with that. We have to sit and theorize and think about the sort of beautiful and powerful solidarities that are always occurring in our communities. But we have to think about that alongside misogyny and anti-Black racism, right? Because all of those things are always happening. Those things are always true, right? And I think it is that tendency of the media to want to tell one story. Latinos are this, Latinos are this, as opposed to accepting and really digging into that diversity. So let me say a little bit about the politics of multiracial whiteness, because I recently wrote something in the Washington Post that got published there, and I was thinking a little bit about, trying to think about the fact that when we looked at the Capitol insurrection, and when you look at Trump rallies in states like Texas or Florida or New Mexico, and you'd see this disproportionately white population, but you would see a goodish number of non-white people there as well, right? You'd see African Americans in places like Texas or Florida. You'd see Latinx communities there. And I wanted to sort of think about what that means. Because certainly the right wants to say that their presence means it's not racist, it's multicultural. And so I think that's the sort of story that they think that the presence of those non-white bodies affirms a certain kind of multiracial, non-racist, that there are issues that progressives and liberals are saying about the racial politics are somehow not there. We know that's not correct. So for me, one of the things I wanted to think about was, on the one hand, there have always been Latino conservatives. There's always been Latinos who vote for Republicans. About 25% of Latinos vote Republican regardless. They vote for Mitt Romney, they vote for Bob Dole, they vote for Donald Trump. They're Republicans and they vote for Republicans. So on the one hand, there's that certain segment that is just conservative. But I also really wanted to think about, what is it about Trump that galvanized and attracted a certain segment of Latinx voters? And for me, that became a question of, a deeper question of, how has white supremacy distorted our politics? How has white supremacy not only distorted that politics for white voters, but how white supremacy has distorted all of our conceptions of freedom and democracy and citizenship? So I was thinking about this idea of how whiteness travels across populations. And so one point I wanted to sort of note is, unlike George W. Bush, earlier Latino, earlier Republicans who tried to appeal to Latino voters, someone like George Bush really tried to appeal to Latino voters by trying to show he understood our history, by trying to show a lot of acknowledgement and recognition of Latinos as part of this multiracial Republican coalition. And he did that through a certain kind of Republican emphasis on Christian faith and family. It also partook of a politics of whiteness. It erased, for example, there was no blackness in the ads, right? Afro-Latinos were kind of expunged from his vision. At the same time, though, it was a kind of multiculturalism in that it tried to say, I know you. He even had ads that said that explicitly. On the other hand, Donald Trump never tried to celebrate or recognize Latinx populations. He knows nothing about these communities. He knows nothing about history in general, certainly not the history of Latinx populations in the US and how we were incorporated here. And he didn't offer any kind of acknowledgement of the distinct identities of Latinos. But what I think I want to argue is, he didn't offer us recognition. What he offered Latino voters was access to a certain kind of whiteness. And when I say whiteness, I'm talking about the ability to join in laying claim to a politics of aggression and exclusion and domination. And so in that way, I think as we think about Latino voter populations and their diversities, I think we need to think about how scholars who studied whiteness and white supremacy, and I'm thinking of work by people like W.B. Du Bois, Ida B. Wells, James Baldwin, Linda Martin Alcoff, Joel Olson, Dave Roediger, Nell Painter. There's a whole body of scholars who've been engaging and theorizing whiteness and white supremacy, many more than I just listed. But one of the points they make is that whiteness is not the same thing as simply being white people. That we need to think about whiteness as a political project. And if we think of whiteness as a political color, then it's something that has emerged historically, it's dynamic, and it's always changing, right? And we need to think about the fact, in part, we need to think about how long in this country discrimination was not simply legally, it was not simply culturally acceptable, it was legally authorized, right? So we need to understand that long history of Indian removal, chattel slavery, Chinese exclusion acts, segregated Mexican schools, all white police forces, racially exclusive housing covenants, Japanese internment, all white juries, segregated facilities under Jim Crow and Juan Crow in the Southwest. We need to understand that we've only been practicing a sort of consistent form of legal equality for a relatively short time. And so my point simply is that long history of white supremacy in which America was free and democratic, or had a sort of access to a certain kind of liberal democracy for the majority of white citizens, but was a much more tyrannical regime for subordinate groups. That is part of our collective political inheritance, right? That white supremacy taught citizens to see freedom and tyranny as interconnected. that it taught us to understand that our own sense of belonging could be forged through violence and exclusion of certain groups and populations. And so I think we need to remember that politics has a long history in this country. And we also need to remember how participatory that politics was, right? That when you were engaging in certain kinds of forms of exclusion, it was something people did together. And I think that democratic element of white supremacy is something that people still, or certain segments of the population still yearn for. So for me, multiracial whiteness is thinking about how this legacy is shaping not only white citizens, but non-white citizens, and how they might also come to embrace a politics of othering, that they might be attracted to the freedom of being able to join into and participate in the politics of demonization and exclusion, and that regardless of your identity, you could be a part of that kind of aggressive, dominating kind of politics. And so I think on the one hand, we need to be excited about the fact that there are a lot of white voters who are resistant to and appalled by the politics of whiteness and are trying to forge something better. And we see that in lots of different political formations since, with the Floyd protests this summer, we've seen it, in a variety of spaces. So on the one hand, we see white voters who are appalled by that. Too many are not, but we have seen a break between a lot of white voters who are really horrified and have been mobilized in their efforts to be critical and allies against white supremacy. On the other hand, we also have to think about the ways that white supremacy can try to lure in non-white populations like Latinx communities, like Asian Americans, even sometimes African Americans. Like how does that logic draw communities into its orbit? And I think we have to think about that side of the story too, so that, but I think my big point is this, that demographics are not destiny. We have to think about how communities are politicized and appealed to. And we have to think about the policies that appeal to them, but we have to think about affect and the affective attachments that voters might have, and think really hard about how we can attract people to our better legacies and not our worst. So I'll stop there.
Great, thank you so much. We are going to start fielding Q&As. I will be reading them just to make sure the question isn't like, what's my favorite pizza? But I'm happy to share that too. Is there a way to separate how we label Latino voters? I'm just wondering if one of the reasons there's a false narrative that Latinos vote Democrat is because the term Latino. It encompasses people from 20 plus countries, which clearly they would not all vote the same. I wonder if it is too big of an umbrella term to label a huge group of diverse voters.
It's interesting. I'll take that one and would love to hear Dr. Beltran's thoughts too, is that white voters are able to be multidimensional, college educated, rural, Midwest, Northeast, coastal elite. So I think the question is not if the label works, but can the segmentation, the attention, and the resources be akin to what white voters expect cycle after cycle. And through that, we'll be able to entertain more nuanced, complex ideas of what it means to be a Latino political voter and part of an electorate that is diverse and that cares about bread and butter issues. I think the failure of mass media, of political elite, of our key societal institutions to reflect the demographics of this country has been a huge loss for all of us, because we are ill-equipped to better understand and then really think about how you organize moving forward non-white people. And so it's not, is Latino, too much or too broad? White is so broad, but we understand whiteness in all of its complexities, especially those of us who really occupy white majority spaces.
Christina, you want to chime in? Yeah,
just really quickly. I think that's exactly right. I think that I don't think there's a term that will fix the problem of overly collectivizing the population. So I agree. I think we have to be much more specific about if we're talking about Latino progressives, or we're talking about Latino women, or we're talking about college educated voters or rural voters. And we don't do that. We don't do that nearly enough. And I think that does speak to a real absence of representation in elite spaces, right? That too often Latino populations and Latinx communities are talked about, not rather than those of, us being the voices out there. That's just really, that's not nearly as common and necessary as it needs to be. And I think that underrepresentation produces a lot of people talking about us in ways that are really problematic. But I also think that there's been times where Latino, the elites that have been doing that representational work have sometimes also fallen prey to wanting to characterize the community in singular ways. I think sometimes I've heard elites from different, kind of national organizations, and this was more common like in the early 2000s, I think, but they would say the Latino community feels this way. They would say like, we value family, and they would make these kind of, so I think sometimes Latino elites have trafficked in stereotypes and simplifications in their efforts to gain a seat at the table and have a voice and be able, and their own hunger to speak on behalf of the community. So I think we have to be, careful about that. It is a tricky thing. I think another example, I don't know if this helps or hurts, but I think that when people talked about women and the gender gap and women and the women's vote, that became a huge problem, because in a lot of ways, the gender gap, as scholars like Jane Jund have argued, it's really about women of color, is a significant difference. And so talking about women, the women's vote, kept erasing the conservatism of white women as voters, right? And the fact that some white women are progressive and some younger, single, unmarried white women tend to be more liberal, but married older white women are more Republican. And so talking about the women's vote has had some of the similar dynamics. So I think sometimes these big terms are tricky, but I think it really is a question of representation more than finding another word.
Wonderful, thank you so much. Here's another one, and I recognize the name. She's actually tuning in from Kentucky. Can you talk about the logistics and the allure of these disinformation campaigns? What makes Latinx communities particularly vulnerable to these campaigns?
Well, so here's the thing that I think about, and I say this both to be coy and crass, but also as a frame. If our political parties, campaigns, and candidates had expended the amount of resources and expertise necessary to segment Latino voters akin to what disinformation, people, organizations, entities, foreign nationals have expended on Latinos, we'd be talking about a more inclusive democracy, and Latinos would not be relegated to receiving information about the election from people that have.
Absolutely. You broke up a tiny bit towards the end, but I think we have the gist of it. Excellent point. Christina?
Yeah, exactly. I think that the fact that so many populations, I mean, the absence of efforts to organize and do civic education in our communities, right? And I think one of the things that you saw in Arizona and Nevada, you see it in Georgia, and I think it really is more has happened over the decades, is that Latinx communities, political organizers have realized that the Democratic Party is not going to save us. We have to save our own lives. And that's been happening with migrant justice movements. It's been happening for decades and decades, but I think the idea that we have to do that work, and we have to advocate and fight for getting resources to do that work. But the fact that communities are neglected and ignored, and then if they're underserved and not, brought into sort of civic life, and then mass media and WhatsApp and these different things can circulate so widely. I think also the age of the population is not unimportant, that it's such a young population. So getting more of its information from social media, possibly. So I think that there's a lot of, larger issues there around civic education and the work that we have to do within our communities. But I think it really does prey on particular populations because there hasn't been that kind of outreach.
Absolutely. Here's another one. Excellent discussion. I'm wondering if you could both speak to the other side of troubling Latinx populations that vote Republican, which is troubling Latinx populations that vote Democrat, even as Democratic Party has also misled and taken for granted the Latinx vote.
So let me jive off of what Dr. Beltran laid out both in her presentation today, but then also in this fabulous op-ed, which is this idea of whiteness and the opportunity to be a part of something that is in many ways in opposite to multiculturalism. And so one of the things that was distinct in terms of Trump 2016 and Trump 2020 was that Trump 2016 was racist, started with going down an escalator, calling Mexicans rapists and criminals. But in 2020, Donald Trump was talking about jobs. He was talking about the lowest unemployment for African Americans, the lowest unemployment for Latinos, even in the midst of a global pandemic, and the highest number of unemployment benefit applications that we've seen that exceeded the Great Recession. And so he was talking about jobs and the economy. He also was talking about employer-sponsored health insurance and how the Democrats were going to take away people's private insurer, again, during a global pandemic. And so in this way, people were able to opt into a Trump who was still racist, but in his appeal to voters was talking about jobs and healthcare, which in a previous slide that I shared are top 5 issues for Latino voters.
Yeah, I think one of the interesting issues, if you look at what Donald Trump was talking about in the lead up to the 2018 midterm elections, it was the caravan, right? It was the immigrant caravan coming. It was very much sort of feeding into the sort of most heightened xenophobic language. And it was interesting the way he sort of tempered that in a particular way as we got closer to the election in 2020. I think this point about, I think sometimes Latinx populations are also the canary in the coal mine on some of these issues. And so I think because we are communities that often have disproportionate numbers of people facing certain forms of precarity. And so I think that is something we have to think about, the way that because communities are feeling vulnerable, that sometimes when communities are feeling vulnerable, that means that they don't necessarily feel, it takes work to convince them that an alternative is possible because you're just trying to hold on to what you have, right? And that can produce a kind of conservatism because you're just kind of trying to hold on to the bare minimum of your survival. And I think it's the kind of work that Bernie Sanders did in the primaries, right, where he was really making a case for an argument for an alternative politics that really resonated with people, right, or at least in certain states, right, when he was doing that kind of on the ground work with organizations and coalitions. So I think you saw that. But I also think that, I think as we unpack, I think this happens to African-American voters as well. There's so much deep ideological diversity within African-American communities, and it gets erased because they vote for Democrats. And we just live in a two-party system that has like a binary choice. So voters have to go one way or the other. And then I think we end up ascribing a lot of things to the Democrats, when in reality, there's a lot of different kind of Latinx Democrats, right? Liberals, progressives, radicals. I mean, there's a whole variety of people who want their part of the American capitalist pie and people who have a critique of capitalism. Those people all voted for Biden for very different reasons and who understand their politics very differently. So yeah, I think that the party issue is, and in the same way that you have, Latino voters who voted for Trump, who some I think were really attracted to the politics of whiteness and domination, and some people who like tax cuts and were attracted to held their nose and voted for him. And then I think there were some who voted for him with enormous pleasure. And I think it's going to require us kind of excavating the internal diversities there to figure out who's who and what was happening inside there. Because it's not like a single story exists on either side of that party divide.
Absolutely. Here's another one. Would want to hear just more of your opinion about this. Biden has mentioned his desire to pass comprehensive immigration legislation. Among the concerns raised by GOP opponents are that new citizens will vote as a solid Democratic bloc. Do you think this is the biggest obstacle to passing comprehensive immigration legislation?
No, but I think that there is empirical evidence that Latinos favor Democratic top of ticket. I mean, that's been clear cycle after cycle. What is alarming for Republican strategists, and this is not new, is the aging into the electorate and the fact that people who eventually do vote will likely vote again because then they're going to be the recipients of information. For Latinos, one of the things to contextualize this with population statistics is that young people in America traditionally under-index in terms of their electoral participation compared to more mature adults. And so what that means is that you have older white voters in California determining public policy for a state whose demographics are majority non-white. Now, what we've seen in the past two elections, 2018 midterms and the 2020 presidential, is that Latinos, along with Asian Pacific Islanders who had the highest increase in their number of ballots cast, are voting. Both of these demographic groups are growing, but they're very youthful. And so to the extent that we are going to have new citizens who are non-white and likely to identify as Latino or as Asian American, what we're seeing is that they're going to participate in ways that we hadn't seen before. And that should be disconcerting for the Democrats and for the Republicans, because that means that they're going to have political voice. Now, the Republican Party has been co-opted by Donald Trump, and there's been a lack of investment to expand the electorate outside of key places where they had really established themselves, like Florida. And so if the Republican Party wants to compete in the new demographics of America, they have an equal opportunity to do so. Whether or not that impacts comprehensive immigration reform, I think is secondary to the desire of Republicans to not have CIR.
Yeah, I agree. I think it's really funny. I always hear, you hear these sort of fantasies about, like, Biden is going to inaugurate communism, and we're going to have, and all Latino immigrants will vote as a bloc, and you're like, the fantasy is, I'm always like, that would be great. I would love if, like, we actually had, like, radical politics happening at the Democratic Party level at the presidency, but that's really not the story at all. It's a different kind of story. So yeah, clearly, and I'm being facetious, obviously, but I think that clearly these voters are much more diverse internally. Although I do know some of the data, I don't have it at hand here, but Sonia might know more, but certainly voters who have been recently naturalized tend to even be more Democratic than, say, third and fourth generation Latinx population. So bringing those folks in with mobilization that tries to bring them into the electorate, is going to have an interesting effect in terms of trying to politicize and bring in that population, the population that has been experiencing. I mean, I think that's another thing that sometimes pundits forget, is that talking about Latinos in California versus talking about Latino voters, like, it's a subset of the community. So there's a lot of people who are politically active, but who, for different reasons, because of their status, their age, et cetera, can't vote. So the electorate and the population overall, there's a difference there that we all recognize, but often doesn't get talked through. And so, but I think as you bring in more immigrant voters, you're going to have a population that's experienced the demonization. And that's going to be really different than, say, a fourth generation voter in South Texas, who, may identify as Mexicano, but also may not know might not have any relationship with anybody. Their family is no longer mixed status. They don't really have a connection to migrant communities. So yeah, we're going to see that, I think.
Great, and we're going to take one more question because CSI and CITS like to end close to on time in order to have people come back to our next event. But this question says, how can Latinx and other communities of colors, immigrant communities, distinguish from discriminatory disinformation campaigns from a non-disinformation, non-fake campaign? And I chose this question because I often am the filter for my own mom, who lives with us, Spanish dominant immigrant, where she says, quiero comprar ese vestido, mira, and I'm like, that looks like a fake company ad, and don't buy anything off WhatsApp ads kind of thing. But I'm her filter, right? Her eye to kind of seeing that. So I know not everybody else has their in-home filter IT person, but what do you guys think? What kind of tips do you try and give people to help distinguish between it?
Yeah, you know, it's so hard because there is, as you mentioned, Dr. Casillas, the trusted messenger within the household, and family goes a long way in Latinos in terms of communicating something that is going to be acted upon. But let's take it out again of the failure of Latinos to be able to overcome targeted deception in a space where there is declining governmental trust and an erosion of faith in political actors at a time when it's necessary to stay safe. And so I think structurally, some of the things that we need is, you know, a regulatory regime that is really able to impart the much needed reforms necessary across platforms, especially the digital space. And that includes in non-English languages. The other things that we need is that we need to restore faith in government. We need to ensure transparency and accountability, and to ensure that people have a sense of what is facts and what is an opinion. Now, under that, outside of the structural, there's a need for media literacy. And so one of the things where we're losing out is the ability to engage in critical thinking to overcome this type of deception. Deception is not new. We've seen it frequently in terms of business practices. How it has evolved is in the social media digital landscape, which is really a place where in all things being equal, for the most part, people can participate for free if they had Wi-Fi and the infrastructure for technology. Now, what that means is that the cost is our data. And unfortunately, the additional cost is access to information that can really dictate whether or not you're able to cast a ballot that is counted, able to get a vaccine or a COVID-19 test. For Latinos in particular, in the short term, in terms of until those lofty, but I think data-backed reforms come to fruition, what's really important in understanding Latinos, and this goes to Latino voters, is that there are trusted messengers, and those are not politicians. They're family members, they're doctors, and they're teachers. Now, how interesting is it that Latinos trust doctors at a time when COVID-19 is occurring? Well, that's great, except they don't get as much face time with doctors as we've seen because of access shortages and then just the abysmal diversity of our physician pool. But let's have scientists carry the message, and let's ensure that it's there with nuance and with care. And that's something that everybody on this Zoom can impart, and really, you know, we all have a role to play as we live in this public health epidemic together to ensure that we're sharing accurate information. But I think the next step is we need to hold businesses, including our digital companies and corporations, accountable.
Wonderful, thank you. Christina?
Oh, I would just say I think yes, everything Sonia laid out. I think the last point I would make is that it was my dad's birthday yesterday. My dad passed away a few years ago, but he was a labor organizer for UAW in Van Nuys. And I always think of the fact that like, this is a moment critical for organizing. And when we think about organizing, we need to think about organizing as a space of persuasion. Right. So yeah, we need all these sort of people that people look to, like teachers, like doctors. But I mean, I think one of the things I think about whenever I go to a flea market or a farmer's market, or I pass a Sephora, I'm like, why isn't there a table there of a multiracial coalition of activists talking to citizens, to young people, citizens and non-citizens, just members of the community as they walk in and out of Target or you know, wherever they're going shopping or what they're doing, and really try to engage people around these questions of their democracy, of their lives, of the questions they have, of their frustrations with their politics. We need to be growing the grounds of agreement. And I think it's just really important to think about our task at this moment is not just one of expressing how we already feel, but really also thinking about like, what is the politics of persuasion in this moment? How do we grow information, and how do we grow the coalition of people who agree with one another? How do we get on the same page around facts? And I think it is going to be that kind of day-to-day organizing in all kinds of unexpected, unanticipated spaces. And I think we have to get really creative about how we expand and extend our democracy. And I think all of us have a real job to do there. And I think a lot of it's going to involve kind of what people have talked about is like deep canvassing, but those kinds of sustained conversations in our communities to help people become self-ruling together. I think that's something we don't just become. Citizenship, I don't think of that as like it's less for me a status as it ought to be at its best a practice, something we do together. And so we need to reimagine, I think, citizenship that way. And I think now's the moment.
Wonderful. I want to thank you two for such an engaging conversation. I told students and friends the first time I heard Sonia on a podcast, I said, I think I need to go to law school, drop what I'm doing. She speaks to me, and Christina I've known for years, and my favorite thing is to always have a drink with her and talk politics as well. So I want to thank both of them, Slugs, UC Santa Cruz alum, for being here and for sharing your wisdom. And as a reminder, they're actually both on Twitter. You could also follow UCLA's Latino Policy Politics Initiative. Do you guys mind putting your handle on the chat? Well, people are thanking you and they loved it. Okay, then we got a couple of Go Slugs in the chat. But Cristina Betran is on Twitter. And I know that I follow Sonia, and I also follow UCLA Latino Policy and Politics Initiative. CITS is on Twitter. Thank you so much, Joe Walter, for dealing with all the tech issues today. We did great. I want to thank Mario, who did the videos for today, and we will have those posted on CITS's YouTube as well as our websites. And CSI just joined the world of Instagram, so UCSB_CSI. So we'd love to see you there. So thank you so much, and remember to practice citizenship.
Thank you all very much. Thanks everybody for joining us.
Thanks.
Stay safe, everybody. Thank you.
Thank you.
See you in person. Bye.
Bye.